Yeah, hello and welcome to our lecture series on climate protection. It's the second lecture in this year 2026. So again, the schedule, just as a reminder, the next lecture on the 21st of January will be not in the Audimax, but in the Kleiner Hörsaal, just on the opposite side here in Agnes Heller House. And Franz Fehr will talk about the SDGs. And the last will be on 28th of January, Ursula Scholl-Dessemann about experimental consumer behavior research. So again, the reminder, please, I would apologize my fault. It's the upload for the task is not today, but on the 11th of February. I just corrected it in the task description. So you have still plenty of time to do your task and then upload it to your participant folder. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Yeah, and then just for the lecture of today, maybe you've heard in the news about the letter of support from many of US researchers in terms of Greenland. So they strongly condemn President Trump's attempt to purchase Greenland on behalf of the United States. So that's a statement from the researchers, and maybe we can talk about this in the discussion after your lecture. It fits very well to one of the issues in the lecture today. Yeah, and today we have the special guest, Ulrich Metschl. He is professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Innsbruck since 2004, and he had visiting professorship in Minneapolis and Venice, and teaching and research activities at the University of Bayreuth, Erlangen, Munich, Eichstätt, and so on. His field of research, and it fits very well here to our lecture series, his field of research range from the logics and philosophy of logics to decision theory and social change theory, as well as political philosophy. But what is especially interesting for the lecture series today in the philosophy and ethics of science. The question is, what type of dilemmas do climate research and experts face? So when ignorance is bliss, almost. Welcome, Ulrich Metschl. Thank you very much.
Well, yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity I'm given here to share some of my musings on a topic. Oh yes, well, my slides might be helpful. Not decisive perhaps, but nice to have anyway. Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I cannot maintain safely that what I have to say really is of utter importance. It's a minor topic, a minor issue, and as you just have heard and learned, it comes from philosophy, so it is certainly less practical than what you have heard in previous lectures in this series, or what you will hear in subsequent lectures. The musings on which I'm touching today, and I will not even be able to offer a final message, a core message, something for takeaway, really for takeaway. The musings turn on the question that arguably at least is some relevance, is pertinent for universities, how science can sustain its credibility which is a necessary requirement for trust in science. And trust in science is, of course, something that has been endangered specifically in context and in connection with climate change. So climate research is something that is pertinent also, and I will come to that later on, for philosophy in various ways. And one aspect is precisely how can we trust science when it comes to climate research specifically, and how can confidence in climate research be sustained? A standard observation in this context is there's too much uncertainty around. In particular, climate research has to offer only uncertainties in some sense. It has to offer even different kinds of uncertainties, but nothing beyond uncertainties. Well, we have to qualify this perhaps in the end. But with surrounded or equipped with so much uncertainties, it's easy for climate research to fall prey to all kinds of interests and even find itself exposed to some sort of denialism. Now, my focus today is even more narrow than that, and I will try to focus on experts' dilemmas in a sense to be explained. The perspective, if I may add that for the beginning, is rather a strategic one, which is not meant to be a sign of quality, or is not meant to imply that this is somehow a superior perspective or anything like that. It's just a description. It is, in some sense, I'd like to say, I could say a strategic perspective, because we are now in a situation, arguably, where we see a lot of technological improvements, technological advancements, but still do not see overall success when it comes to abate climate change, to mitigate climate change. So the situation is somewhat akin to one would find oneself in when one wins all the battles, but still is losing the war. I'm aware that perhaps such a bellicose language is not what one should use in these days, but nevertheless, it's a good picture and allows to locate to some extent where the parachute is coming down. So for the outset, for the beginning, what we simply may state, and what you all will accept, is that certainly we have made progress in many ways, even political progress, perhaps not to a degree that we would desire and that we can welcome. But anyway, there is some progress, even more technological progress. We do know about renewable energies, energy efficiency, on and on, but still greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. We have not made real success with reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. This is what the 6th assessment report by the IPCC unequivocally states, and it comes with a dire warning, the warning that, as they write in the very beginning in their summary report, that pace and scale of climate action are insufficient to tackle climate change. Now, the IPCC has, of course, become more determined and less reluctant in its assertions regarding climate change. The first assessment reports were rather cautious, but since the 4th at least and 5th assessment report, the IPCC is quite unequivocal that climate change is going on, and that it's anthropogenic climate change, human-made climate change, and we have to do something about it. Now, here is one of these charts, a Y chart, that demonstrates and is evidence that greenhouse gas emissions are still on the rise. And for a number of years now, we are consistently above 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, which is not a wholesome situation. Well, Will Rogers, a TV showman back in the 1940s, 1950s, once coined the apt phrase, "If stupidity got us into this mess, how come it can't get us out?" And of course, stupidity is not what will bring us out of the ongoing climate change, for the simple reason that climate change is something that really needs research, really depends on science and scientific findings, scientific research, first to be identified, and then also when it comes to developing and propagating potential solutions, abating climate change. Now, without Without climate research, we wouldn't even know about climate change, and would even less have any option, any possibility to fight climate change. The IPCC, at any rate, is underlining the urgency, and this is all what we need for the moment. What we need instead, of course, instead of stupidity, is scientific expertise, and scientific expertise comes from experts. Before I turn to the experts' dilemmas, which are my main topic today, perhaps it is instructive to explain a little bit in what ways and in what relations philosophy stands to climate change. Going back, I start with the consensus on climate change and the question with which I also commenced just recently. Why is it that we see so scarce success, that our measures are so weak in some sense, so insufficient, as the IPCC just stated? There are, of course, conflicts of interests. It's mainly economic interests we could cite, which we could refer. There's also political resistance now. The US government is sort of wary of climate change, the very idea of climate change. There's some negligence. That could mean and does mean and is meant here in the sense that we sometimes see other political issues ranking higher on the agenda to the effect that climate change, even as is promoted, there's some sort of climate damage even done by what we see as political actions. Think, for example, about the Russian war in Ukraine. But that means that in this sense, climate change simply does not have the attention it would deserve and would mandate. We see also technological path dependencies. That means, and then one comparison that is often used in this connection is that when it came to CFCs, carbon fluoride gases, then which did damage to the ozone layer, then it was comparatively easy to find a substitute to replace CFCs and to protect the global public good of the ozone layer simply by using other gases. Now, such a replacement, such a substitute is not available as readily for fossil fuels, and therefore we do not see the same success when it comes to the protection of the atmosphere as we saw when it came to the protection of the ozone layer. There might also be psychological factors. It could be that consumers, all of us, are somewhat reluctant to change their habits, their modes of living, their lifestyles, and some would outrightly resist any significant changes in their lifestyles, and that, of course, is also something that is perhaps bad for the climate. And then we might have insufficient scientific communication or science communication. That is, science is not sufficiently able to communicate its results to a wider public so that this would have a significant impact on our actions and deeds. And this leads to the question how perhaps science communication could improve the situation, could lead to a better result, and could advance climate mitigation, or if not mitigation, then at least sufficient adaptation. Now, as I said, it's perhaps instructive just for orientation to spend a few words on the relation between philosophy and climate change, and why climate change has also become, perhaps surprising to some of you, a philosophical issue. There are, of course, first and foremost, moral and ethical questions connected with climate change. One rather urgent question is how we can conceptualize something like a collective responsibility, given that the individual actions, what every one of us does, except if we are, say, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift is arguably the person with the largest carbon footprint on Earth, according to calculations. But none of us is Taylor Swift, so whatever we do is rather modest in comparison and will not have any significant effect on the climate. Therefore, it's not so much individual responsibility that counts, but rather some sort of collective responsibility. The climate change comes about because of what we all do together, collectively. Now, this is a still quite open question how collective responsibility can conceptualized. There's, of course, the more mundane question, let's say, of an ethical way of life. What could frugality mean? How could a frugal way of life look like, one that is more sustainable in some sense? There are questions that are on the border between the ethics and political issues, distributive questions, for example. How should we allocate costs and burdens that come with climate change and adaptation, perhaps, or measures for mitigation? This is summarized under the headline of climate justice and includes questions how we deal with future generations. So how much can we discount the future, for example, is an also to some extent open question. There are outrightly political questions that have to do with our conception of liberal democracies. If there is a climate change going on, would it be so severe with its expected effects that coercive measures are justified? Should we give up our rather liberal attitude of thinking, for example, in terms of consumers' autonomy? Should we simply ban some types of action? Should we sort of allow only a certain number of flights per person per year, flight miles or whatever? Or would nudging or a softer version of guiding behavior, shaping behavior be enough? And is nudging justified, or to what extent would coercion be justified? There are even metaphysical questions. For example, what about our concepts of nature? What is nature actually? And has nature any rights? And if so, can we design a legal system of law that accounts for these rights and attributes rights to nature, in contrast to simply in contrast to legal systems that simply turn to persons, natural persons or legal persons? And then there are epistemological questions, questions pertaining to the philosophy of science. First, we see the development of what is called now attribution science, a branch of science that tries to find out what exactly can be, what effects can be attributed to what causes, and to what extent are certain weather phenomena, extreme weather phenomena, for example, due to climate change, or to what extent are they to be expected by simply a natural variation in weather patterns. This leads to questions about causation, and this of course leads to questions in statistics. And then we have types of uncertainty. The IPCC, for example, works with two types of uncertainties, likelihoods and confidences. And this in turn has implications for how we make decisions under uncertainty. And this is where experts again come in, because experts are to some extent expected to help us, to guide us in making good, reasonable decisions, even under conditions of uncertainty. Now, the idea of an expert's dilemma is not entirely new. Experts' dilemmas came up, the observation that there is something like an expert's dilemma came up in the context of technology assessments, when it became clear that certain technologies, new technologies, would have effects, side effects, unwanted side effects perhaps, so that one saw reason to at least try to think in advance what could be the potential consequences of certain technologies. Are these consequences desirable? and what would even a cost-benefit analysis look like regarding the potential consequences of certain technologies. One observation in this context and arising in the context of technology assessment was already that we have various types, different types of experts' dilemmas. The first type of an expert's dilemma, the type 1 dilemma, simply is given by disagreement among experts. What we often find is that experts do have and utter different assessments, come with different assessments. They do not agree in their judgment whether something is beneficial, how likely something is, and on and on. Now, this leads to questions: if there is disagreement among experts, then of course the public, the wider public, is confronted with the problem to say, well, who can be trusted? Who is reliable? Who is a more reliable expert, perhaps? Whose information is reliable and to what degree? And a further question is then, of course, also, who's an expert anyway? Is anyone an expert? Nowadays, the expert's dilemma, in particular, given the wider use of artificial intelligence, even means and is sometimes understood in the sense that anyone can be an expert simply by making use of artificial intelligence. Now, the second type of an expert's dilemma, and these are the traditional types of expert's dilemmas, the second type of an expert's dilemma consists in, or is given with the observation that experts are the ones who have the expertise, but not the political authority. So political decision is one aspect, and knowing what to do is a different aspect. So if you would ask experts what we should do, then they would come up with a certain, perhaps very definite and unequivocal answer. But on the political side, we see that this answer is one that will not be implemented for whatever reasons. One sort of threat or consequence of this situation could then, of course, be that evidence-based decision-making becomes harder and is less likely, which is not what we want in many ways. But political considerations indeed could turn against the expert's advice. Another consequence related and quite similar could, of course, be that the expert's advice provokes resistance. So the public, the wider public, is perhaps not happy with the expert's advice, feels even in some cases paternalized, overruled, and is not ready to accept what the experts recommend. This results, of course, in some sort of political resistance and is to be expected to some degree within democratic societies, which are open and free societies, and therefore allow a variety of opinions and attitudes. Now, who's an expert? Now, this is I hope you can see somehow the paper, the title of the paper. It is a paper on climate change. It's written by Richard Lindzen. Richard Lindzen is an atmospheric physicist, and in that sense, he seems to be an expert. He's also a sort of, well, dissenter in the sense that he argues against the scientific consensus on climate change. So he thinks that what we observe or as climate change is exaggerated, and he warns of climate alarmism, as he calls it, and he even proposed a hypothesis, the iris effect, claiming that global warming, as it goes on, if it continues, will in particular warm sea surface temperature. With warmer sea surface temperatures, we will see less cirrus clouds, And with less clouds, there will more infrared leakage from the Earth through the atmosphere than previously. So that would be a negative effect, counterbalancing in some sense global warming. So that Linsen argues that this alleged climate change is nothing to worry about, or at least not as much as the scientific consensus otherwise claims. Linsen's hypothesis is largely, if not refuted, it's not completely implausible what he says. According to other experts, you see how disagreement comes in. But it is, at least today, and by the majority of climate researchers, not really taken seriously any longer because of inherent flaws it has, and because Linsen underestimated some other effects, which would add, of course, to global warming and would increase climate change. Now, is Linsen an expert? Well, in some sense, yes. In another sense, perhaps not so much. A different example from biology, Barbara McClintock. She was the one who discovered what is now called jumping genes, transposition in genes. Her research was for many years more or less dismissed for various reasons. One reason could be, well, she's female. Another reason is she was a rather shy person who liked to work rather in isolation and would not seek so much interaction with her scientific community. But in the end, her hypothesis, her claims were proven right. So what she claimed in the 1950s became generally accepted, at least in the late 1970s, with some delay, therefore, but it became accepted. It is now accepted, and she certainly may count as an expert. The point is, and this is what I want to get across, the point is that in particular for lay people, it is not easy to discover and to discern who is an expert and who is not. So we are certainly at a loss in many cases to say this is reliable expert information and this is not. It's in particular experts who can appreciate who an expert is, and layperson have a hard time figuring out who the experts are. This is kind of a reversal of the Dunning-Kruger effect, of which you may have heard, a psychological phenomenon that says that if you're ignorant, then you really have a hard time to understand your own ignorance, and even to find out who is apart from you also ignorant. So as being ignorant, you're unable to identify ignorance. Being an expert, you are in the privileged position to identify expertise, but not being an expert, that's harder for you to do because you might, in fact, even fall prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect. The expert's dilemma was to be seen, and again is to be seen at work. Actually, one suggestion could be that the COVID-19 pandemic provided ample illustration for the experts' dilemmas. What we did experience in these days, if you remember, at least vaguely, 5 years ago. Anything wrong? Yeah, you can hear me. You're still with me. What we did experience, if you recall these gloomy days 5 years ago, then one of our experiences was, of course, that we saw experts' opinions changing almost on a daily basis, and that, of course, prompted question about expertise and who is an expert and what is now reliable information. Is it an information that will be valid for a certain amount of time, or is it just something that will be passed over next morning? So this is certainly I think has been a period that highlights at least that type of expert's dilemma, the prevalence of disagreement among experts. We also saw during these days examples of the type 2 dilemma, namely that experts had a certain expertise, but it was an advice that was not politically feasible. It was not possible to implement the expert's advice politically. Sometimes the advice was perhaps politically dubious. In some cases, it was perhaps for other reasons that one would rather refrain from implementing the expert's advice. So in some cases, expert advice for political reasons might be dismissed, sometimes for the wrong reasons, and sometimes perhaps also in democratic societies for good reasons. There's some worry among sociologists that modern societies sometimes rely too much on scientific expertise, thereby crowding out the genuine political decision making. If this worry is justified, it's a different issue, something we do not have to decide here, but it also depends a bit on the possibility, the very possibility of experts' dilemmas. And then, of course, there's a popular field of recommendations on your daily nutrition and diet. And we all know that in some years it's good to consume such and such, and other years it's bad to consume the very same thing. Think about coffee. Coffee was seen as something that is bad for your heart for many years. Now it's probably very good for your heart. It's good against cancer and Alzheimer's disease and whatever. Think about the famous daily glass of red wine. For a while, it was highly recommended to have a glass of red wine each evening, but then it became rather dubious, rather to not have a glass of red wine, too much alcohol. So we see this changing almost by a seasonal pattern, and therefore it is unclear again for the public what the expert's advice really means and what it consists in, and what the justified opinion really could be in this context. So what is a reliable judgment by experts? There is a theoretical background, and this is known among experts, by the way, as consistent Bayesian aggregation, or rather the problem of consistent Bayesian aggregation. It is called Bayesian because the agents and these models are supposed to be Bayesian agents. A Bayesian agent is one whose beliefs, again, are modeled by probabilities, probability functions, numerical probability functions. And these Bayesian agents also have preferences, and these preferences also get a numerical shape in terms of utilities. Now, if you have numerical utilities and numerical probabilities, what you can calculate for any agent is something that is called, in microeconomics at least, an expected utility. The expected utility for any option the agent might have and might face. Options could consist in, say, the choice of bundles of goods. It could be political alternatives, whatever it is. Anything can be an option once it is open for a decision. It's an alternative in the context of decision making. Now, if you have a group of agents, then of course we have to face the problem how we can aggregate the individual agents' opinions, judgments perhaps in terms of expected utilities, into a collective choice. Now we have a group choice to be made. The group wants to decide, for example, a family wants to decide on a holiday destination, and each family member has his or her own ideas about where the holiday should be spent. Each person expecting some expected utility from the holiday destination Now, how do we aggregate? How do we come to a result for the group that is in some sense reasonable, maximizes in some sense perhaps even the utility of the group? And we have basically two options. We could do that ex ante, or we could do it ex post. Ex ante means we first aggregate the individual beliefs and the individual preferences, trying to aggregate them into collective belief and collective expectation, the probabilities, and collective preferences, and then form collective expected utility from these two independent values. Ex post means we first determine the individual's expected utilities and then aggregate the individual expected utilities into something like collective expected utility. The problem is these outcomes are not necessarily the same. You cannot expect the same result. You are perhaps not that much interested in such a formal exercise, but just to show how it roughly works by these tables, we do assume agents, we do assume options, agents facing options. These options are well, think about the options as actions, something the agents may do. And an action with its outcome depends on circumstances. So taking an umbrella when it rains leads to some outcome because you have the benefit of staying dry. Taking an umbrella when it does not rain leads to a different outcome. It's somehow burdensome to carry around the umbrella the whole day when it's not raining anyway. Therefore, the utility of your action depends on the possible outcomes on the given situations that you face. Is it roughly clear what that means? Well, vaguely, I mean, just vaguely is sufficient. Now, and then calculating these outcomes and their desirability in terms of utilities, you get something like expected utility. Then you might first calculate the expected utility for each option, each possible action, for each agent, and then try to derive from these individual expected utilities a collective expected utility, or otherwise you do not calculate expected utilities for the individual agents, but rather take their individual assessments of the situations, their probabilities, their beliefs, and their individual measures of desirability, their preferences, their utilities. Utilities are just numerically measured preferences. And then you calculate collective expected utility out of these two values. Again, this is not necessarily the same. Now, the point is that thereby we violate, this is the theoretical background, we violate some seemingly plausible requirements for collective decision making. One seemingly desirable condition for collective decision making would be that if everyone believes that such and such is the best option, then collectively we should settle on that as the best option. Okay? If everyone in the family believes that a holiday at a ski resort is the best option, then the family should go to a ski resort. However, with the intricacies of Bayesian aggregation, it is not to be expected that such a collectively superior, the technical term is Pareto superior option, will actually be chosen by the process of preference aggregation for Bayesian agents. Now, this is somehow, let's say, a bit annoying, if only for technical reasons. It is annoying for a more philosophical reason, because it points to the limitations of decision-making, public or collective, political decision-making, under conditions of uncertainty, when in democratic free societies we also allow and must accept that people have different opinions about what is desirable and what is not. We do have conflicts of interests, conflict in preferences, and we do have different assessments about what is likely, what is not so likely. Given these differences in preferences and beliefs, quite natural for a democratic society, we are somehow, at least theoretically, at a loss to say how democratic societies should make decisions under uncertainty and under conflict. And this is a bit the background of the expert's dilemma in one sense. Now, Karl Kraus, always good for reasonable advice, simply would say, well, when in case of doubt, do the right thing. Yes. Try to heed that advice anyway. So this is just to emphasize, re-emphasize the broad picture. This is a theoretical problem in the background of the expert's dilemma, one that is connected with the expert's dilemma. There is a further systematic problem coming in terms of systematic disagreement, and this is a sociological observation, or at least a sociological claim, if not eventually an observation. Now, Niklas Luhmann, already 40 years ago, has advanced an argument that modern societies are at a loss when it comes to facing what Luhmann called an ecological crisis. And certainly climate change is an ecological crisis. Luhmann's observation is perhaps running even deeper than the just mentioned formal observation coming from social choice theory, because Luhmann's argument was that modern societies typically are and must be accepted as highly differentiated. What modern societies bring with them is societal subsystems. It's not just that we have society as a system. Society as a system consists of subsystems. And these subsystems mean that in a society, different functions are exerted by different subsystems. Within a society, we would have, for example, the economy, we would have politics, we would have the law, we would have science, we would have religion, we would have culture perhaps even, and on and on. There is no end to the differentiation that the societies can undergo, and therefore we cannot limit the number of subsystems that constitute a society in the end. Now, each of these subsystems has its own specific agenda. The economy is about, well, making money in some sense, putting it very bluntly. But the logic of the economy is about having property or not having property. So the economy is about property, just as the subsystem of science is about truth, having truth, or the subsystem of religion is about having faith, and the subsystem of politics is about power, exerting power, having power, and the law is about righteousness. So these are different and different functions with different norms and values which do not transgress the borders of their specific subsystems. Now, a system, in addition, is characterized by its feature to close itself off from its surroundings, and these surroundings are the environment. Now, environment is in some sense a system theoretic specific term, specific for systems theory a la Luhmann. It is also in Luhmann's description in this connection with coming to the ecological crisis, of course, meant as the environment as we normally perceive the environment, something that is around us, nature. Luhmann's question is, how can a society highly differentiated in its subsystems respond to an ecological crisis when this crisis is one that, as an ecological crisis, comes from the environment as something that is opposed to the whole society? Now, each of these subsystems now will find its own response to this ecological crisis, and each of these subsystems will have its own language to deal with this crisis, and none of these languages are compatible with each other, and none of these reactions by subsystems are uniform and do agree with each other. So what we cannot expect, according to Luhmann, and I certainly simplify somewhat, is that a modern society differentiated in subsystems will have the means to respond in a uniform manner across these subsystems to an ecological crisis. This is a problem for a society, as Luhmann puts it, for its communication. And the communication is necessary because even an ecological crisis, even climate change, will have any effects within a society, for a society, will provoke any response and reactions of a society only if it is sufficiently transmitted, if it's communicated to society. Now, with the environment as something that is in some sense alien to society, societies find themselves bereft of the means to respond properly to an ecological crisis, and in this sense also to respond properly to climate change. This explains to some extent why we see conflicts of interest, as previously mentioned, that of course are hampering and are an impediment for unanimous response reaction to climate change, and make it so hard to counter climate change in many ways. In some sense, we can also say that what Luhmann points out in this connection is what he suggests in one way is that we have a third type of an expert's dilemma, and now the experts are situated within the specific societal subsystems. So we have economists, and we have scientists, we have politicians, and we have law people, and each of these groups has their own specific terms to capture an ecological crisis, climate change, but none of these languages, none of these conceptualizations are compatible with each other, and they will not find a uniform language that would allow them to coordinate their reactions. In this sense, and perhaps by observing this sort of differentiation of societies in societal subsystems, we can also explain how it comes that science is in some sense misapplied, in particular with regard to climate change. Not only climate change, but this is perhaps the most urgent case. In a way, we could say that scientific research was sort of seized by stealthy operations with an end that is completely foreign to what science really wants, and rather is meant to serve very partisan ends. Now, this has brought home to us, as many of you perhaps known in particular by the historians of science, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. And what Oreskes and Conway pointed out was that beginning in the 1960s, one saw endeavors for funding science, for funding research that were not meant really to help and improve scientific knowledge, but rather were meant to deflect political action that would have been possible without further research. How does it work? Well, the standard case has been the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry started in the 1960s to fund research on lung diseases. It has been known roughly since the 1940s, for rather obvious reasons, that tobacco smoking, cigarette smoking, correlates with the incidence of lung cancer. That was more or less settled knowledge. Nevertheless, the tobacco industry funding research on lung diseases simply meant to prolong, in some sense, extend the range of uncertainties, arguing that as long as research is going on, questions are open, and as long as questions are open, we must not fear that government regulation will ban tobacco smoking. Government regulation can't ban tobacco smoking simply because we still and always can say, well, there are still questions to be answered. We have to wait for the answers before we finally can accept any regulation. Now, what Oreskes and Conway claim and argue is that the gun manufacturers, the oil companies, and in this connection, even all the industries causing, in some sense, being responsible for climate change, were following the pattern that was laid out by the tobacco industry, and also started to fund research, not with the end to improve our knowledge, not to foster, promote knowledge, scientific understanding, but rather to prevent government action. In this sense, we see that science somehow was abused, and science is in a bad situation to ward off that kind of abuse. It does not have the means for a proper defense against such clandestine operations, but rather it would, of course, willingly accept, as we all do when we are offered money for our research, the funds to do more research, right? It's quite understandable from a scientific perspective, but from a society's perspective, this, of course, is science misapplied. Now, science is exposed to that sort of misuse, misappropriation, we might say, simply because science is not committed to satisfy things. When it comes to technologies, we can accept that something is good enough for technological purposes. When it comes to scientific result, we never can say that it's now good enough, but a scientific result is one that can indefinitely be improved on. So our knowledge is not a knowledge that finds a halt at some point, but rather, having reached a certain point, we still can ask, well, is it really true? Can we do any better? Can we learn more about it? And this, of course, means that science is committed to maximizing and not to, as it's called, satisfying. This is a result of the tentative nature of scientific findings in some sense. And because of its tentative nature, it's always a scientific result in some sense, and privileged result always sort of is accepted temporarily for the moment, given what we know now, but that does not preclude that at a later stage we would overthrow our insight, what we think we know today. Now, given that this is sort of an inherent feature of scientific research, science was to some extent, must be expected to be a victim of this strategy applied by certain industries. And this is perhaps a fourth type of an expert's dilemma, the dilemma that now consists in an inability to say what is really the case in a sense that is acceptable, that is sort of offering sufficient guidance for public decisions. Scientific research would have to say, well, yes, we strongly believe and we have reason to accept for the moment that such and such, but of course there might come further evidence in the future which prompts us to modify, to revise our current insights. This is somehow a dilemma when it comes to the public function of science. Now, with regard to climate change, at least to indicate some positive aspect, when it comes to climate change, we could at least say that there is a strong consensus. And as Naomi Oreskes has argued in a further book, more recent book, we may trust science. We are sort of encouraged to trust science, allowed to trust science even, because science normally typically rests on strong consensus. So the classical argument that science so often has changed its judgments, has seen so many overthrown beliefs, why should this be different for climate research? To this, the answer is, well, yes, we see this sort of scientific revolutions, a change in scientific assessments, then this is typically the case with regard to beliefs that were not consensual. Where we found strong scientific consensus, we also found that this was rarely, if ever, overthrown. Now there is a strong consensus that climate change is going on, and therefore we must not expect that we will in the future modify, revise our judgment about climate change. Still, of course, there are dissenters, and the good news now is that dissenters very often are incoherent. Stephen Lewandowski and co-authors have made the point that the sort of incoherence we find in climate denialism, what they call climate denialism, is sort of indicative of this attitude, in the sense that the incoherence comes about not within single groups by single agents, but rather consists in the judgments of different agents, different groups. Some would say, for example, just to illustrate what sort of inconsistency, incoherence is meant, there is, for example, within the climate denialism scene, the assertion that we are unable to measure the global temperatures with any precision. Statement one. Statement two is there has been no increase in temperatures between such and such years in that period. Now, if you say that there is no precise measurement, then you have a hard time to say there was no increase in temperature. And if you say there was no increase in temperature, then you sort of allow that a precise measurement must be possible. And you can't say that there's no precise measurement possible. The point is that this indicates that climate denialism is not interested in sort of resolving these contradictions, and therefore is not committed to finding out how it really is, what really is the case, but rather is satisfied with accepting a more or less ideological stance. Now, if you press this point hard enough against climate denialists, then they would try to seek, arguing that now they obviously have an incoherent position. Now, pressed to restore coherence, they then would say at a higher level, well, yes, but climate science, climate research is sort of bought anyway, is unreliable completely. Now, that is not quite helpful and simply indicates that there is no epistemic commitment within the scene of climate denialism. That is the good news that by following, let's say, the path of coherence, we, to some extent, come about or find out about reliable scientific results. So much for the positive news, and this is a good news. This is good news because it allows us finally to say, or at least to suggest in a preliminary way, what would be beneficial for a society. A society then may refer to experts who strive for coherence, and the experts' judgments are reliable and are trustworthy to the extent that they are coherent and try to form a coherent pattern. Now, this is precisely what is the case with climate research, and therefore, the upshot, climate research is reliable, is trustworthy, despite the fact that we find, of course, specific points, specific items, disagreement between experts, even in climate research, that we do have a problem with the experts dilemma type 2, namely that experts would come up with certain suggestions which are politically perhaps not completely feasible, and on and on. But at least we have a basis, a foundation for a sound science communication. This is good news because in the end, and this is a more or less concluding remark already, that ignorance is not an option. And sometimes perhaps ignorance might be bliss when it comes to private issues, perhaps, but collectively ignorance will never be bliss. Still, of course, we do have problems with science communication. It's unclear how we can solve these problems, how we can make science more resilient, perhaps, with respect to attacks coming from, for example, climate denialists and others. But at least, and this was what I tried to outline, to sketch in a hopefully not too hazy way, there are, at least despite all these experts' dilemmas we face, reasons to believe, to still believe in science. So much for today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I think really interesting, and we can have some interesting discussion about this. There are some open questions you left in your lecture, and that's really good for discussions. So if any questions or points of discussion, just raise your hands and we'll hand you over the mic. And if the online participants, you answer the question or ask the questions.
First of all, I want to thank you for the very interesting informations. And I have two questions. The first one, I don't know, is it a philosophical question or a psychological question? I would have expected the room here crowded with young people because you are talking about their future. And what I observe is that older people like us, are talking about climate change and possible solutions. So I don't know, is it resignation or is it technical optimism, expecting that modern technique could solve any problem? Or is it something else? That's my first question. And the second question is concerning the conflict between nature conservation and environmental protection. I think many modern techniques, sustainability techniques, have a big impact on nature. And that could be another problem raising from possible solutions. So every sustainable solution, like for example, windcraft or electric hydropower, is also has an impact on nature. So maybe we are creating another problem by solving the other one.
Sorry, I'm not sure that I understood the question acoustically. So it was about solutions and technologies and resignation, but what was it exactly?
Okay, maybe I was too close with the microphone, or I spoke too loudly. My first question was, why are so few people here, young people? Since
Pardon?
Young people, since
Yeah.
you are talking about their future and not ours. And the second was, what do you think about the conflict of nature conservation versus environmental protection? Because I see that many solutions for the climate change have a large impact on nature, like for example, windcraft or hydroelectric power stations. They take a lot of nature, and so maybe we cause another problem by solving the first one.
Der Konflikt, was die regenerative Energieerzeugung zum Beispiel dann auf Naturressourcen hat, den Konflikt sozusagen.
Well, but these are empirical questions, and the typical approach would be, and I'm not sure that I could think of a better one, would be to start with a cost-benefit analysis. So proposing certain measures with expected benefits, calculating the costs, including those that had not been foreseen, consequences that were not sufficiently taken into account at the beginning, and then try to see whether this is a reasonable solution or not. It depends on specific aspects, and I'm not sure that this would allow a general answer, schematic answer. Would this somehow meet your question?
The question about the younger generation and the older, what you mentioned in the first question?
I was briefly alluding to generational conflicts in connection with aspects of and questions of climate justice, because in this connection, this is a serious problem. But otherwise, the point about climate change and the expected effects and detrimental effects or harms brought about by climate change are such that certainly everyone must be expected to suffer from them, irrespective from age and generation or whatever. So I'm not sure that being younger, being older is such an urgent issue in this connection. But perhaps you have an argument to convince me otherwise.
As a question or comment? Just raise your hand.
Well, all questions answered. Perfect.
Maybe a question from my side, or maybe a suggestion for an answer to one of the dilemmas of the type 1 dilemma. It's about the disagreement among experts. So if there is some uncertainty and how to deal with it from political side, for example. And we had a lecturer from Hamburg. He was is an economist, and he had a very simple solution, and that's precaution. He said, if there is some rest of uncertainty, and we always have some rest of uncertainty, there's never 100% security ever in research and science. If there is some uncertainty, but the cost is high, in this case, it's our foundations of life on Earth, then the only solution is precaution. And he is an economist, and he says our dealing with resources in this way we do it now doesn't work in future on the obvious results from science with some uncertainties. And his answer was precaution.
Okay, so I would say it depends. Precaution, the precautionary principle is a not completely unreasonable principle, one could say, but it is, of course, a very highly defensive principle. And there are certainly situations in which one would say that it's too defensive, too restrictive. And sometimes, I mean, what would it mean in many cases? It would mean first, do nothing. And when it comes to disagreement among experts, disagreeing judgments, disagreement assessments, then it would imply that we do not give out any judgment, any assessment. Now think about something like the weather forecast. In a typical situation, so meteorologists do have a scorekeeping about their institutes, which one is best, the BRIA score. And that means, and is based, of course, on the observation that meteorological institutes do disagree about the forecast, quite naturally so. But now, being in disagreement, it would not be an option for them to say, okay, no, we will not issue a weather forecast for next because we have disagreement. No, they rather would, what would they do? Issue different forecasts, and that's fine for us. We sort of try to meddle out what suits us better or worse. So in many cases, I think that disagreement as such, and the experts' disagreement when it comes to assessments, sometimes it may be justified to stick to the precautionary principle and try to play it safe. But in many other cases, I think that just would be too restrictive. So the standard approaches try to find sort of perhaps an average, but that of course must be qualified and must be weighted a bit by sort of the trustworthiness of different experts. That's what the BRIA score for meteorological institutes is good for, right? So if you, very mundane, homely example, if you do a calculation, try to sum up a greater number of figures, and you come to a value, result, you have your result, and you find yourself in disagreement with someone who did the same calculation but came up with a different result, then it might be reason to think over your calculation. But say if it was a child of just 6 years having learned to add sums up to 20 perhaps, then you would say, well, okay, I can see where the mistake is and it's not on my side. Then in that case, you would not have reason to rethink your calculation. Very much depending on who's trustworthy for you, who do you think is reliable and who is not. If it's a peer, then of course you will sort of retreat from your initial assessment to some extent. If not, then not. And that means that the precautionary principle is fine in some cases, in others, too restrictive.
Was there questions or comments? Yeah. So.
I wanted to comment on the question from the sir. You talked about nature conservation and disrupting it by protecting the climate again. Is that right? Like that, yeah. Well, isn't it also ignorant to just not do anything about it, and then we would kill the animals probably too? So if it means doing hydroelectric functions into the water where we would kill also some animals, but it would protect us in the long term, and maybe the animals will recover too. Wouldn't it be a better solution then to yeah, try our best to find a way? Yeah, well, of course. Yeah. Thank you.
Is there a way to use the knowledge about the experts' dilemmas against people who are ignorant, to convince them that maybe their opinion is wrong, or not wrong, but maybe not thinking a longer term? Is there a way to use the knowledge about the expert dilemmas against people who want to ignore the truth?
Yes. Well, in some sense, by definition, experts are the ones who want to know the truth, right? That there are others who rather would prefer to remain ignorant is something, well, that is to be expected to some extent, to some degree. But this is in itself not something that would have any implications for the expert's dilemmas, because the expert's dilemma is sort of has to do with the experts first and foremost. It has, of course, to do with the impact that experts' opinions, experts' judgments could make on the wider public. Now, here it is assumed, of course, that modern societies are interested to be guided to some extent by experts. What I did not mention was that I started with a few hints, perhaps, that one problem today is to specify the role that science and scientific research, academic research, is to have for modern societies. And a standard sociological assumption is, of course, that we nowadays live in so-called knowledge societies in which knowledge and information have become even economic factors, which are almost replacing earlier economic factors, labor and capital, and are at least as important as previously in the industrialized societies, for industrialized societies, labor and capital had been. Now, if that is somehow acceptable, that modern societies sort of are willing to accept experts' advice, then of course we can also allow to some degree that within any society there are some who rather would prefer not to learn about scientific results. This will not really do so much harm to scientific progress or even to society's progress. There's a famous anecdote by I don't know who brought it into the world, but it goes. It has to do with the wife of an Anglican bishop, and the wife of the Anglican bishop learning about Darwin's theory of evolution, and her reaction is to say, "Oh my God, descended from apes. Now, may God make that this is not true, but if it is true, may he at least make that no one learns about it. So this is sort of a kind of a injunction, a prayer for ignorance in some sense, but this is of course not the attitude that is so typical, I would say, for modern societies. And if someone decides not to learn from science, to remain ignorant, then our reaction simply could be, well, go ahead on your own risk. Does that help?
Questions? Yeah, this one.
Is possible you can briefly assess the role of social media and theory of conspirational theory in denialism of climate change? It's possible to explain briefly, because in your relation there was nothing about it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the role of social media. Yes. In some sense, one could say that what social media are doing now and the effects they have on public discourse and public communication and also science communication is aggravating a problem we had with traditional media already. So there are studies demonstrating that traditional media typically were misrepresenting the scientific attitude, scientific judgment on climate change. They were sort of misrepresenting the uncertainties that were discussed within science in a way that made them look like uncertainties about climate change as a whole. That has been demonstrated in particular for more conservative media, classical newspapers. And of course, this is now has become an even more serious problem with social media. Now, well, what one could say, and this is perhaps rather empty anyway, or a trivial point, is that the only means one could easily think of is simply better education, more science education. If it really helps, depends. It is currently perhaps not so much an option to try to regulate social media. And of course, to some extent, it's also, we might say, a challenge for science communication to learn how to cope and present themselves in social media. But that, of course, would also mean that science education as a whole sees some improvement. Otherwise, just stay away from social media. It's no good anyway. Pointless.
Okay, that's a question. So may I come back to the slide I've shown about the letter of support for Greenland, and this was referring to the type, but it was type 3 problem, the subsystems. So we have subsystem scientists and some subsystems politics. Do you have some hint at least how to bridge this gap in between?
Well,
to think out of the box or talk out of the box.
But in this specific situation, our problem seems almost to be that the standard conception, the Luhmann conception for society doesn't work properly any longer, because there's a president who sort of dominates so much, not just daily discussions, but the whole society, though the subsystems have not become pointless, but on sort of unable to perform their proper functions. It's politics not just in the sense of exerting political power, but it's a type of politics exerting power in a roundabout way, in a way that is sort of upsetting society as a system. Insofar, I'm not sure that the expert's dilemma is our most serious problem in this connection. There's a more serious one, I'd say. But yes.
There might be one solution which comes from data science. Data scientists use this kind of mapping. If they have different subsystems and they want to have them communicating to each other, they have some mapping technologies. That's quite from data science, but maybe on society you can transfer similar thinking, that you have mapping of language, mapping of methods and so on, to bring them closer together and speak the same language all over the boxes. Maybe this could help.
If I understand correctly, this suggestion, it sounds as if one would say that one has something like a functional equivalence within the systems. Now, Luhmann, taking Luhmann seriously, would say that this won't work, because the point about the society subsystems is precisely that they perform different functions. So they could not perform different functions if there weren't the structures equivalent, and there would be some sort of common structure between them. They work on different assumptions, on different bases. So one of his examples is that he would say, well, yes, given the subsystem of science, the binary coding that is relevant for science is true and untrue, false, not true. The coding cannot be, for obvious reasons, true versus, say, ugly, right? That doesn't work. Despite the fact that all these subsystems do have a binary coding. For the law, it's law-abiding and not law-abiding. For the economy, it's having and not having. It's in each case sort of a two-valued system, we could say, but nevertheless, this is not sufficient, does not allow us to say that we find a functional equivalence within these systems. They perform simply different functions, and therefore sort of kind of looking for these equivalences, these mappings, would be pointless.
Yeah, it could help for a common language, but not to have a uniform function, but it's not necessary. The different functions should work to solve the same problem. You have on Earth one problem, and all the functions should work to solve this problem.
Yes, but because they are different subsystems, the problem for each of these subsystems becomes a different problem. So the problem, the ecological crisis for the economy is a different problem than the problem of an ecological crisis is for science, or perhaps even for religion, or politics. So they would not even have a common, kind of a core concept, enough common ground to formulate the problem that they somehow share. They do not share any longer the problem. That makes it so according to Luhmann. I mean, Luhmann is, just if I may add that, never shy of sweeping claims. And sometimes when reading Luhmann, say, okay, maybe that goes a bit too far. But nevertheless, I mean, taking him somehow seriously, he has a point that would explain why a coherent and uniform reaction to something like climate change is so hard to come about.
I understand. Okay, further question? I'll have a look also on the online. Maybe there's some in the meantime. There's not. No. So comment from the audience. Doesn't look like this. So yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. Thank you for coming and the discussion. Yeah, and looking forward to next week. Then not in the Audimax, but in the small lecture hall. Yeah, looking forward to see you there. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.